They said it so casually, as if they were talking about an old box of Christmas decorations or a broken chair that still needed to be stored away for the season. Out of sight, out of mind. Whispered, not even discreetly, but with that cruel softness people use when they want their contempt to sound like practicality. And those words followed me down the wooden stairs as my son's hand hovered near my back, not to steady me, not to offer help, but to make sure I kept moving forward into the basement where they had decided I belonged. And the echo of his wife's voice lingered above like a closing door, sealing me beneath their carefully curated lives. I am 81 years old, I remind myself each morning now, when I rise in my rented apartment above the bakery, where the smell of rising bread greets me with more kindness than my own blood did. But back then, in those days when I was still living, in that house bought with my husband's pension, I had not yet found such simple mercies. I had only the damp air of a cellar and the gnawing sense that I had been erased, not through violence or sudden abandonment, but through the quiet bureaucracies of family cruelty. The basement had once been where we stored preserves, where the children's bicycles leaned against the wall, where laundry dried in winter when the air was too cold outside, and now it was where they stored me. A body still breathing, a mind still aware but treated as clutter, an inconvenient remainder of another generation's life. And when I asked if I might at least keep the small lamp from my old bedroom upstairs, my daughter-in-law smiled tightly and said the overhead bulb was more than enough, as if light were a luxury I no longer deserved. At night, when the house above was filled with their conversations, with the hum of their television, with the clinking of wine glasses during dinner parties I was never invited to join, I would lie on the narrow cot pressed against the concrete wall and listen through the vents, and it struck me with a sharpness that never dulled, the way they erased me even in front of others, for when guests asked where I was, my son's voice would float down like a verdict. She's resting, or worse. She prefers her space. And I wanted to shout, to pound the pipes, to cry out that I did not prefer the cold. I did not prefer the silence. I did not prefer invisibility. But my throat would close because I had been raised to believe that mothers endure, that mothers bend, that mothers swallow, and somewhere along the decades of endurance, I had mistaken silence for love. Still, there were moments when the humiliation pressed so heavy it leaked out in tiny rebellions. Once, I left my teacup unwashed in their pristine kitchen sink, and the next day it was returned to me on a tray like contraband, with a note in Carla's handwriting. Please keep your things downstairs, as though a mug could contaminate her gleaming countertops. And another time, when I lingered too long in the hallway, looking at the photographs they had framed, none of which showed me, none of which showed even Daniel as a child, only Carla's parents in Rome, Carla's sister in Manhattan, Carla's children from her first marriage. I heard Carla whisper again to him in that careful tone, "She makes people uncomfortable, you know." And his silence in response was worse than agreement. It was consent wrapped in cowardice. The details piled up like dust. The way the basement light switched off on a timer. So sometimes I sat in sudden darkness. The way the only window was half covered by the ground outside, so that all I could see were shoes walking past, or the occasional cat slinking by. The way my meals were left on the top stair in plastic containers without so much as a word, as though I were a tenant who had fallen behind on rent. tolerated only because eviction would cause scandal. I had been a nurse for 35 years, standing through double shifts, steadying hands through births and deaths, paying off debts one overtime shift at a time, and I had raised Daniel alone after his father passed, pouring everything I had into his education, his stability, his chance at a life that would not require cots in basements. And yet, when his life finally gleamed, when the house sparkled with the sheen of upward mobility, there was no place left for me except beneath it. Like the foundation everyone forgets exists until it cracks. Sometimes I would hold the photograph of him as a boy, the one I kept hidden in my Bible, his hair too long, his smile missing a tooth, and I would whisper into the cement, "Do you remember me?" As though memory itself could descend the stairs and sit with me in the damp. I am telling you this now not because I want pity, but because I want it recorded somewhere in someone's mind, that this is what it feels like to be erased while still alive, that it is not always the abandonment in airports or the sudden shutting of doors. Sometimes it is the slow moving downstairs, the careful placing out of sight, the whispers that reduce you to burden, and the cruelty that pretends to be organization. And I want you to know who I am now, 81, independent again, above ground, above the bakery where the windows open wide, where the smell of yeast and sugar and warm bread fills my lungs with reminders that life can still be generous even when people cannot. I am no longer a secret kept in a basement. I am a woman who has climbed stairs. Others thought she could not manage. And though my knees ache, though my back protests, each step I take upward carries the weight of every silence I endured. And it is a weight I no longer intend to carry alone. It began on a Tuesday that smelled faintly of bleach and damp cardboard, the kind of morning when the basement window filled with a shallow bowl of light and the dust in the air lifted like tiny birds that had forgotten how to fly. And I had shuffled my way to the top of the stairs because the timer had clicked the ceiling lamp into darkness again, and my hands were shaking from balancing an old enamel mug in one palm and my pills in the other. And when I reached the kitchen, the house was empty of people, but crammed with their voices. The echo of my daughter-in-law's laughter still clinging to the stainless steel, and my son's careful tone. Always careful, always reasonable. Left behind like a fingerprint on the refrigerator. And there on the table, under a dish towel that pretended to be modesty, lay the documents that would show me exactly where I stood in the architecture of their plans. A stack of forms topped by a brochure whose cover featured a smiling woman with hair set like a helmet, captioned "Your Path to Peace of Mind," and beneath it, paper clipped neatly, the power of attorney language printed in a font so clean it felt like a lie. My name, not as I speak it, but as banks prefer, bracketed by numbers and signatures, and a notary appointment written in Carla's meticulous hand for Thursday at 10, and next to it a sheet where my medications were listed without the full dosages, as if someone had decided that the facts of my body needed editing to match the story they were telling upstairs to their guests about a mother who was tired and safer downstairs. And I stood very still because I knew, with the certainty that had made me a good nurse all those years, that a decision made in a bright kitchen at 10 in the morning will carry more weight with the world than a mother's whisper at midnight through a vent, and that if I blinked or sighed too loudly, the room might rearrange itself and claim none of it had ever been there. I did not touch the pen they had placed to the right of the signature line, as if good pens had the power to sanctify bad intentions. And I did not call out their names, because I had learned that calling was a way of giving them the chance to pretend. Concern to rehearse their favorite lines about keeping things simple. So instead I looked, and I kept looking. And I saw in the lower corner of the brochure a photograph of a courtyard with a magnolia tree and a caption that read, "Secure Memory." Wing. And I thought about how memory does not need wings. It needs windows. It needs a chair in the sunlight and someone to ask you about the year you learned to dance. And then I lifted the towel fully and found a letter already sealed and stamped. To the bank I had used since Daniel was in Little League, requesting a change in mailing address for my statements to be sent to the family residence for ease of oversight. And there was the phrase that made something colder than anger settle into my bones, ease of oversight, as though I were an account to be audited, as though I were a business expense that had failed to justify itself. Later that day, they came home in their brisk way. Coats half shrugged off before the door closed, the baby squealing at the pitch that makes adults smile with their teeth and not their eyes. And Carla called down the stairs, not with greeting, but with instruction that dinner would be later because they had errands. And my son followed 10 minutes after with a bright folder in his hand and a voice already practicing its reasonable cadence. And he said that a notary would be coming on Thursday to help us get on top of things. And he promised me it was only medical and only for emergencies and just in case. And then he slid the paper nearer like a saucer slid toward a cat, and my fingers, which have steadied countless needles, curled in my lap because I did not trust them not to betray me. And I asked him very quietly whether he had read the part that gave him the right to sell what he called junk in the basement and what I called the inheritance of a life, and whether he had noticed that my maiden name was misspelled, and whether he would please answer one question with the truth. If I signed, would I ever sit again at the table by the window upstairs and drink coffee in the morning light? Or would the basement become my permanent address until a white van with a logo took me to a magnolia tree that other women stare at through locked doors? He hesitated just long enough to tell me everything, then smiled a smile I did not recognize, a careful one that looked like compromise but felt like surrender, and said it would take the pressure off everyone and would protect me from making complicated choices. And I thought of every complicated choice I had made alone since the day his father died. The mortgages refinanced at the kitchen table, the checks written with hands that did not shake, the drives to midnight pharmacies in 2 different winters. And I understood that the protection he offered was a polite word for disappearance. That night my bell, yes, the little bell they left by my cot so they could tell themselves they had given me a system, rang and rang while I waited with a cramp in my side. Not an emergency, nothing that would make a headline, just the small indecency of being 60 steps and a locked door away from a bathroom. And somewhere above me, they were arguing not about me, but about whether the notary would prefer espresso or tea. And I sat on the edge of the cot and counted the seconds the way I used to, count breaths for newborns, and in the counting, I found a clarity that was not dramatic and not even particularly brave, only exact. And it was this: that the papers on the table were not a misunderstanding to be smoothed with patience. They were the plan, and I was the object the plan required. The next morning brought confirmation dressed up as coincidence, because the mail, which had been haphazard for weeks, was suddenly a neat bundle tied with kitchen twine left in a plastic bin at the top of the stairs, and in it I found an envelope, addressed to me with my son's handwriting on the back in tiny letters. Mom, sign where highlighted and leave by the bell. And inside the pages had yellow flags stuck like bright little tongues, saying, sign here. And there in the middle, a paragraph that handed over to him not only my medical decisions, but the right to manage, liquidate, and reallocate assets for my best interest as determined by him. A phrase so confident it forgot to wonder what my interest might look like if I were the one doing the determining. And I felt a heat rise in my face that was not shame anymore, but its opposite, the returning of blood to a limb that had been numb. I did not sign, and I did not ring, and when afternoon drifted into that dull hour when kitchens go quiet and dinner parties have not yet begun, I heard Carla on the phone in the room above, her voice pitched low, but not low enough to outsmart old Vence, saying to someone, I assume the notary or a friend who collects tidy stories, that I had finally reached the stage where it's kinder to take decisions away. And then she said, a sentence that will live in me as long as my lungs do. She's out of sight now. It's easier on everyone. And the words clicked into place with the first whisper I heard when they led me down the stairs on that very first day, forming the lock that the judge would one day call a key. I put the papers back in their spread as neatly as I had found them, because neatness was a language they respected. And then I took the only actions available to a woman set aside without witnesses. I wrote the exact date and time on the back of a grocery receipt with the tiny pencil I kept tucked into my Bible. I photographed each page on my old phone that they thought was too outdated to be useful. I photographed the bell by the cot and the mildew that had begun to flower in the corner. Behind the dryer and the single window whose view was a rectangle of dirt and the occasional shoe, I folded those images into the private archive of my pocket, and I sat on the step halfway between up and down and told myself out loud, in the voice I used to use with patients who were almost ready to push, that there would be a day when someone would look me in the eye and ask me to speak, and when that day came, I would not be warming up for the role. I would be ready. And if my voice shook it, would only be because a voice unused to light trembles when it first leaves the dark. I began to notice that the cruelty was not in grand gestures, not in shouted words or slammed doors, but in the slow accumulation of small erasures that together built a wall higher than any I had the strength to climb. And the more I paid attention, the clearer it became that I had been cast not as a mother, not even as a guest, but as a piece of furniture to be arranged where it would not disturb the picture they wanted the world to see. At first it was the little things, the way my meals began arriving later and later, placed on the top stair in plastic containers, not handed to me with even the courtesy of eye contact, as though I were a tenant in arrears or a dog to be fed when convenient. And if I did not collect the tray quickly enough, the sound of Carla's heels would tap impatiently above me until I obeyed. Then there were the visitors, couples from her circle who came for wine and talk of property values, and when their laughter echoed down through the vents, I heard my name not once, not as a mother to be introduced, only as a burden explained. Away. She's resting. She prefers quiet. And that phrase, prefers quiet, struck me each time like a needle because I did not prefer it. I endured it. And endurance is not the same as choice. The days slipped into one another until I no longer knew if I was waking in morning or evening, for the basement light clicked off every hour on its cheap timer and left me groping in darkness, the damp air thick with detergent and the faint musk of earth. And sometimes I sat on the cot, afraid to move, because to stumble against the boiler or the concrete wall would remind me too sharply of how far I had fallen in my own son's house. I kept my small rebellions hidden, a teacup rinsed but not returned upstairs, a slice of bread taken without asking, the faint scratch of a pencil across the back of an envelope where I recorded each day's indignities like a nurse keeping chart, though there was no one left to hand it to. Silence was the true weapon, I came to see. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of deliberate forgetting, the silence that thickens around a person until she is no longer certain her voice carries past her own teeth. My bell, the little brass bell they had left by the cot to reassure themselves they had given me support, stood there like an insult, because when I rang it, nothing came. And still, I rang it some nights when the cramps in my hip twisted me out of sleep, not because I expected rescue, but because I wanted proof that sound could still exist in that room, proof that I had not disappeared entirely. Neighbors must have wondered, I thought, about the light never burning in the downstairs window, about the way I was never on the porch, never at the mailbox, never at the market. Once, through the slit of the window half buried in soil, I saw a small boy crouch and press his drawing of a bird against the glass, his breath fogging the pane, and for a moment I raised my hand as if to wave, but he was called back by his mother, her voice brisk, and he vanished, leaving only the childish outline of wings behind. That moment stayed with me, the way even a child could sense there was someone down there, though the adults upstairs preferred the fiction of emptiness. What made it worse was not anger. Anger at least is an acknowledgement, but the calm efficiency with which they behaved as if I were a background detail. Daniel's voice changed when he spoke to me, slower, rounder, as if testing for comprehension, but sharp when he thought I could not hear. Carla began leaving her friends' coats in the basement during parties, draping them across the chair by my cot, so that I sat among them like another garment waiting to be claimed. And more than once a guest came down to retrieve a jacket and startled. At the sight of me, muttered a polite greeting, then fled, embarrassed not by my situation, but by the awkwardness of having glimpsed it. And so the days grew heavier, not with any one blow, but with the repetition of invisibility. The way they rewrote the story even while I was still alive to contradict it. The way each omission pressed against me until I began to doubt whether my memories of raising Daniel, my sacrifices, my labor, my laughter with him when he was small, were not just elaborate inventions to comfort myself in a cellar. I reminded myself by touching the deed in my purse, by looking at the photograph hidden in my Bible, by speaking aloud into the empty air. I am here. I am not resting. I am not confused. Yet even as I spoke, I understood that the longer I stayed, the less certain anyone outside those walls would be of my truth. Because erasure is not sudden. It is the drip of water on stone, and I could feel already the grooves it was carving into me. The escalation was not in volume, but in quiet. The measured tones, the sealed envelopes, the careful arrangement of coats, the trays on the stairs, the clipped introductions upstairs where I had become a friend, never a mother. That was how they dismantled me piece by piece, and the most terrifying part was how easy it became for them, how natural. Until I realized that if I did not act soon, if I did not claim the evidence of my own existence, I would indeed become what? They whispered, out of sight, out of mind. One morning, the air in the basement felt heavier than usual, the kind of heaviness that makes even breathing a labor, and I sat there staring at the damp wall, wondering whether the day would pass like all the others, until something shifted. Not in the house, but in me. A quiet certainty that if I stayed still one more hour, I would dissolve into the cement itself. So I stood and climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the banister with both hands, every joint aching, but my will sharper than the pain. And when I reached the kitchen, I found the room empty. The sun pouring across the counters in a golden line, the silence thick but not yet hostile. And there on the table was the stack of papers I had seen before. The neat folder, the pen, waiting. The legal script that spoke of guardianship and power and convenience, and instead of recoiling, I leaned closer. I read every line. I let the words pierce me until they became undeniable. And then I pulled out my old phone, cracked at the corner but still alive, and I photographed each page carefully, steadying the camera with my breath the way I used to steady thermometers under children's tongues. Because now the evidence was mine, and evidence was a form of breath. Proof that I had not imagined the plan to erase me. I didn't stop there. I photographed the tray on the stairs with its crusted plastic lid. I photographed the bell beside my cot with dust gathering around its base. I photographed the mildew darkening in the corner, the single small window clogged with dirt, the string of coats that had been draped near my bed as if I were a coat stand myself, and each picture was not just a record, but a statement, a whispered testimony into a device too old to impress them, but still sharp enough to catch the truth. For the first time in months, my hands did not tremble. They obeyed me. They remembered purpose. When I returned downstairs, I sat on the cot and pressed the phone to my chest, the cool plastic firm against my skin, and I whispered aloud, "Not invisible. Not yet." And the sound startled me, because it had the steadiness of someone I used to know, someone I thought I had lost. I reached for my Bible, not to pray, but to slide the phone inside its cover, because I wanted those two objects to touch. The book that had carried my mother's handwriting in its margins, and the device that now carried my proof, old faith and new witness side by side. From that day, the rhythm changed, though no one upstairs noticed. I began keeping a record in fragments, receipts with dates, small notes scribbled in the dark, the hour when meals arrived, the hours when they did not, and I placed them in an envelope marked with my maiden name, because my maiden name had not yet been stolen by anyone's convenience. Some afternoons, when the house was empty, I ventured into the yard and let the air wash over me, not long enough to be caught, just long enough to remind myself that the sky still existed, that I could still lift my face to it. The true midpoint came not in discovery, but in recognition. I was not powerless. I was not merely a figure in their narrative. I was a witness gathering material, and witnesses are dangerous to those who rely on silence. Each photo, each note, each quiet step upstairs became a defiance more solid than shouting, because shouting could be dismissed as confusion. But photographs cannot be unmade, dates cannot be unwritten, and I felt in my bones that a time would come when I would be asked to speak, not in whispers through vents, but aloud. And when that time came, I would not arrive empty-handed. That evening, as I sat by the cot folding the receipts into order, I remembered myself decades earlier, hunched over medical charts at 2 a.m, careful to write each number clearly because clarity meant safety. And I realized I was still that woman, precise, stubborn, unwilling to let another's carelessness decide the fate of those who depended on her. Only now, the one who depended on me was myself. I smiled, though there was no one to see it. And for the first time in that house, the smile was not bitter. It was a vow. It began with a sound so ordinary that for a moment I thought I had imagined it. A polite knock layered over the low whir of the washer and the timid clicking of the basement light's timer. A knock that traveled through the bones of the house into my bones until I realized it did not belong to family or friends, because my family had forgotten the courtesy of knocking, and my friends had been politely trimmed from my life the way Carla trimmed the rosemary in her garden. And when the door opened and footsteps moved across the kitchen in shoes that did not hurry, I knew with the quick intuition I had learned in triage that the world outside had finally pressed its ear to our wall. I heard Daniel's voice reach for its practiced calm, the register he used at work and when he wished to be persuasive without revealing his intent. And then a woman spoke with a measured kindness that did not try to sell me anything. The kind of voice that announces itself as a witness before revealing its title. And she said she was from Adult Protective Services, responding to a concern from a neighbor about an older woman who seemed to be living in a lower level without safe egress. And Daniel said there must be some mistake because his mother preferred her privacy, and the downstairs was a temporary arrangement while they renovated the guest room. And the woman did not argue. She simply asked to see me. And in that moment, I recognized the first true escalation, not because volume rose, but because the door between their story and mine had cracked open. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with my hand on the banister and waited. And when Daniel called down with forced cheerfulness that someone from the county was here to say hello, I climbed, step by step, not rushing, not apologizing for my pace. And when I reached the threshold, I faced a woman in a navy cardigan with a clipboard folded against her chest and eyes that did not flinch from mildew or discomfort, and she asked very gently whether we might speak where the air was easier to breathe. And I, who had spent weeks inhaling detergent and damp earth, said I would prefer the kitchen table. Carla appeared then, as if conjured by the word table, carrying a bowl of lemons and an expression that tried to braid concern with annoyance. And she said, of course, anything to make me comfortable, and began to answer questions not addressed to her until the woman lifted a hand and said she would like to speak with me privately if that was all right, because that is how real concern sounds, like permission rather than permission's costume. We sat, and I laid the photos I had taken near the edge of the table, not as accusation, but as record. And the woman looked at them without drama, took a breath, asked if the light truly was on a timer, whether the bell was functional, whether the coats were always kept near my bed during gatherings, whether meals were left on the stairs rather than brought down. And I answered in the same steady way I had learned to deliver difficult truths to families in hospital rooms, not because I wished to humiliate my son, but because the facts had to be spoken in full sentences to matter. Daniel stood at the far counter with a smile too tight to be polite and said a dozen small things about safety, renovations, temporary arrangements, his voice filling the room with words. The way a scented candle fills a closet until you can no longer tell if you are smelling the thing itself or its intention to persuade. But the woman took notes without acknowledging him and left her card beside my tea. And before she stepped away, She asked whether I felt free to come and go, whether I had access to my identification and bank cards, whether I understood any papers I had been asked to sign. And the question went through me like a clean wind. Not because I did not know the answer, but because someone had finally gifted me the dignity of asking. When she left, promising a follow-up, the house closed again around us like a mouth deciding whether to swallow, and the afternoon carried the metallic taste of a storm. Daniel waited until the front door clicked before he spoke. And when he did, it was with a softness that grazed cruelty, that long coaxing tone that says, "If you had not made us worry, we would not have needed to arrange things this way." And Carla took the card from the table and turned it over in her hand as if a number could be rubbed off with enough pressure, then set it back down an inch farther from me than it had been. And in that small displacement, I saw their plan. To drown the visit in reasonableness, to escalate their caution while pretending to de-escalate conflict. The escalation also arrived by mail, in envelopes that began to come more frequently, and with a purposeful precision, a letter from my bank confirming a requested change of address and a new trusted contact designation for my accounts that I had not requested, a letter from an insurance company with my son's email attached, a brochure from a senior residence whose magnolia tree looked familiar because I had already seen its twin on the table that morning, and when I called the bank using the old phone no one thought could still connect. The young man on the line asked a series of questions that I answered without stutter. My social security number, my previous addresses, the name of the street where Daniel learned to ride a bicycle. And when the last answer landed with that satisfying click of recognition, the young man's tone shifted from script to person, and he said he was flagging the request as suspicious and would record my statement that I had not authorized it. And then he suggested adding a passphrase that only I would know, and I chose the maiden name of my mother's mother, a woman who had once carried me from a storm cellar to summer light. And when I hung up, I felt the delicate tininess of victory, the way a seed feels in the palm, small but undeniably alive. Carla began to limit my access to the upstairs without saying she was doing so, and this too was escalation disguised as care. Doors closed softly behind her like well-behaved children. The laundry schedule shifted so that the machine hummed during the hours when I used to climb for air. Guests were routed through the side entrance so the coats no longer piled near my cot, as if removing witnesses could undo what witnesses had already seen. When the notary arrived 2 days later, brisk and perfumed, carrying a neat stamp and the assumption that this would be tidy, I asked for her business card first, and I asked whether she had been engaged by me or by my son, and I asked whether she intended to witness a signature executed in a basement or at a table with a window. And the questions were pebbles dropped into what they imagined was a still pool, revealing currents, because the notary blinked and said she could not proceed if anyone was uncomfortable and would prefer to schedule when my independent counsel was present. And Carla's smile split for a second, like paint over water damage, and Daniel said something about efficiency, and the notary said something about liability, and the papers retreated back into their folder like insects surprised by light. That night, the timer on the basement lamp was set to a shorter interval, so I sat in the darkness more often than not. And on the stair, a container was left with a note that said, "Eat while warm," which felt more like a command than a kindness. And I understood that each time I refused an erasure, they would find a smaller method to erase me, and that knowledge did not frighten me the way it would have weeks earlier. It clarified me. The police came for a wellness check the following week, not because Daniel invited them, but because the social worker returned with a supervisor who had the patience of someone who had seen too many rooms like mine and decided to arrive with a uniform in case the house needed the sound of authority to remember its obligations. I had dressed that morning in my navy dress, the one Carla found too formal for mornings, because I wanted to meet the officers as a person, not a circumstance. And when they asked whether I was safe, I told them I was safe enough to answer questions, but not safe enough to be invisible. And I opened my Bible and showed the photographs and the dates and the careful notations with the same steadiness I once used to read blood pressure charts. And when Daniel tried to explain again the temporary nature of things, the officer with the softest eyes asked whether the upstairs bedroom had a bed and whether that bed had ever been offered to me. And the silence that followed was not long, but it was complete. And in that completeness, I heard the house tip a degree toward truth. They did not arrest anyone, because life does not bend for our satisfaction. But they wrote things down, they left me a second card, they looked me in the eye before they left. And that looking was like oxygen. Escalation has a rhythm, I learned. It comes and then retreats. And just when you think you have weathered its crest, it returns as something you did not anticipate. And so it was that the next wave arrived not as a demand that I sign something, not as a visitor with a badge, but as a performance on the internet. A post from Carla's sister with our address blurred and my face replaced by a sepia photograph from a family reunion in another century. A caption that spoke of a beloved elder who had become confused and private and had withdrawn for her own peace. And though I do not care for digital applause, I understood the strategy, that they intended to wrap their control in a quilt of public pity, to turn my disappearance into a virtue others could like and share. And what frightened me was not the post itself, but the speed with which friends and acquaintances affirmed it. How ready people are to accept a narrative that allows them to keep their hands clean. I did not reply because I have learned what happens to women who defend themselves in public without the amplification of institutional authority. But I clipped a printout, wrote the date on the margin, and slid it into my growing envelope of proofs. Because proof is my new oxygen, and I do not waste it. There were allies I did not expect, and they too are a kind of escalation. Because when help appears, you must decide you are worthy of it before you can accept it. The courier who brought groceries heard me humming through the vent, and, instead of pretending he had not, said loudly into the kitchen that he had left the bags by the back door and then dropped a business card through the basement window with the quiet precision of a man passing a note in class, the name of a legal clinic for seniors circled in blue ink. And when I called the number later, careful to time my words to the rise and fall of the dishwasher, a woman named Patrice listened without interruption and told me that if I could get to the clinic on Thursday, there would be a lawyer who would file an emergency petition for an order that would at the very least force a hearing. And I said I could not leave without being noticed. And she said, in a voice that felt like a hand beneath my elbow, that I did not have to leave. They would come to me with an investigator like the one who had already visited, and if I wanted, I could authorize them to request my medical records and to speak. To the bank with the passphrase I had created, and I agreed, because the midpoint had taught me to collect, and the escalation demanded I surrender the fantasy of managing this alone. Daniel tried one more angle, the oldest in the book, a soft avalanche of affection that arrived just after he saw the officer's card on the table and realized that reasonableness had reached its limit. He brought down a folded quilt from a cedar chest and told me it had been my mother's, and that he had found it while looking for photo albums, which may even have been true, and he laid it over my legs and used the word we so often it felt like a chant. We worry, we love, we just want peace. And then he asked if I would come upstairs for dinner. And I did, even though I understood this invitation was not quite about dinner, because you must sometimes step into the theater to expose the script. At the table, Carla had arranged cloth napkins and candles in the afternoon light, as if trying to persuade the sun to behave like evening, and she placed her palm over mine and said she wanted to help me with my paperwork, and that if I signed one form it would relieve me of the burden of decisions. And I took a sip of water, thinking of the clinic and the bank and the officer's eyes, and I said that I had decided already to have my papers reviewed by someone whose last name was not mine, and the silence that followed was what I had been moving toward without knowing it. The moment when a lie realizes it has been fully seen. That night, the house became a test. The timer shortened again so that the light extinguished in mid-thought. The washing machine set to chug into the small hours so that sleep frayed into strips. The stairs slick with something I could not see, and I moved carefully as if through a hospital corridor after a code, slow, precise, unwilling to give the house the satisfaction of making me a patient. I packed a small bag without the drama of a flight, the Bible with the photographs, the envelope with the receipts, the phone, the card from the social worker, a navy dress that makes me feel like I still have shoulders broad enough to carry my name, and I placed the bag near the foot of the stairs where the shadow met the first light from above, because that is where I am positioned in this story now, not in the dark, not yet in the full brightness, but exactly on the line that leads to it. The next morning, the social worker returned with her supervisor and a third person who did not introduce herself until she had sat and listened for a long moment to the house's hum. And then she said she was a pro bono attorney assigned through the clinic, and that she had already filed a petition for an emergency hearing, and that a judge would want to hear directly from me, and that the papers I had photographed would be helpful if I could email them. And I laughed in a way I had not in months, because I do not email, but I do photograph, and photographs can travel through younger hands, and the attorney said that was more than enough. Daniel tried to protest, not by shouting, but by expanding himself with words, and the attorney let him finish, and then asked him, point by careful point, whether he would commit in writing to moving me upstairs immediately, to restoring my access to my mail and accounts, to canceling all pending notary appointments, and he said he would rather wait for legal guidance, and in that decision, he made everything easier for me, because Light loves a straight line. I slept for 2 hours that afternoon, deep and clean, the kind of sleep that comes the day after a fever breaks, and when I woke, the house felt different, not kinder, not repentant, simply less sure of itself, as if the walls had realized they were not a fortress, but a stage, and that the audience had arrived early. I stood, walked to the mirror I had propped against the brick with 2 books, turned my face left and right, and I said my maiden name aloud, then my married name, then the name I will carry into the room where a judge will ask me to speak, and the sound was low but unbroken, a river under ice. Outside, in that narrow ribbon of view the window allowed me, the neighbor's magnolia had begun to show its first waxy cups, and I thought about the brochure on the table and the lie of its caption, and I touched the phone, and I touched the Bible, and I touched the envelope, and I told the house quietly that I was ready for the next knock. Because escalation, when you survive it long enough, teaches you the simplest truth of all, that pressure reveals the shape of what it cannot crush. And at last I had remembered my shape. The morning of the hearing, I rose earlier than I had in years, not because anyone told me to, not because I feared missing a schedule, but because my own body wanted to stand before the day and meet it fully awake. And when I opened the window above the bakery, the scent of bread lifted into the room as though the world itself were wishing me strength, and I took that strength into my hands as I buttoned the navy dress, the same one Carla had once dismissed as too formal for mornings, the same one I had kept pressed and ready for an occasion no one expected me to be granted. I carried with me the envelope of photographs, the grocery receipts with notes scrawled in pencil, the letter from the bank acknowledging suspicious requests, and the clipping from the newspaper where Adam had spoken of me as though I were a runaway, pet rather than a mother. I carried them all not like weapons but like bones, the evidence of my own body, proof that I had existed in full view even while they tried to push me below ground. The courthouse smelled of paper and polish, and when I entered the courtroom, the air was taut with that mixture of boredom and curiosity that hangs around places where lives are quietly decided, and my son was already seated at a table with Carla. Beside him, both of them in tailored shades of gray, as if grief had been their stylist, and when Daniel saw me, his face rearranged itself into something between surprise and calculation. But I did not lower my eyes the way I once might have. I looked at him steadily until he looked away. The judge, a woman with hair pulled back into a knot that looked capable of cutting glass, called the room to order, and her voice did not waver when she said my name, not as mother, not as friend, but as petitioner, the legal word that gave me back the place in my own story. They tried to speak first, Daniel with his practiced calm, explaining that concern had guided every decision, that privacy had been my preference, that oversight was their duty, and Carla with her rehearsed sorrow, talking about confusion, vulnerability, safety, the words stacked carefully like blocks in a child's game, hoping no one would notice that the base was missing. And then it was my turn, and the judge asked if I had anything to present, and I placed my envelope on the table and slid out the photographs, one by one, the cot beside the boiler, the coats draped near my bed, the mildew in the corner, the bell gathering dust, the papers with signatures waiting like traps, and as I spoke each detail the room grew quieter, not because I was loud, but because the truth has a timbre that cannot be mistaken once it is heard. I told them about the timer on the light, the meals left on stairs, the forms that shifted my name into their possession, the lawyer who came to the cafe to suggest my well-being was best handled on paper, and I told them about the whisper that had begun it all, the whisper they thought had dissolved into air. Out of sight, out of mind. I said it clearly so that the syllables rang against the walls, and I saw the judge's pen pause on her paper. Daniel began to protest, saying I had misinterpreted, that my memory was unreliable. But I interrupted him, the first time in my life I had ever cut across his speech, and I said firmly, "My memory is the only reason you have a life to speak of." And my voice did not tremble, it carried. The judge leaned forward then, her eyes steady, and she asked me directly whether I wished to remain under the oversight of my son, and I answered with a calm so deep it surprised even me. I wish to remain under the oversight of myself. Silence followed, not long, but enough to feel like air after drowning. The ruling came quickly, sharper than I expected. The petition for power of attorney denied, the prior documents voided, my independence affirmed, and when the judge closed the folder, she looked at me not with pity, but with recognition. And she said, "Mrs. Harlow, please come upstairs." As if she knew the irony of the word, as if she understood that all I had wanted was to no longer be beneath anyone's feet. When we left the courtroom, Daniel avoided my eyes. Carla murmured something about misunderstanding, but their voices no longer had the architecture to contain me. I walked out into the hall, and the light through the windows struck my face full on, and for the first time in years I did not lower my chin. I walked slowly, but not timidly, each step deliberate, each breath deep, and I understood that whatever came next, letters, visits, attempts to rewrite the story again, would not matter in the same way, because the decision had been spoken aloud in a room where silence had no power, and my voice had joined the record. That evening, when I returned to the small apartment above the bakery, I set the envelope of documents on the counter and poured myself a cup of tea. And I stood by the window looking at the street below, where people carried loaves wrapped in paper, laughing, arguing, living without knowing they had just witnessed a woman climb out of a basement and into her own name again. And I let the steam from the tea blur my vision until it felt almost like rain. And I whispered to myself once more, but this time not as a vow, only as a fact. Not invisible, not anymore. Now my mornings begin with the sound of the bakery below, stirring itself awake, the rattle of trays, the hiss of ovens, the low murmur of voices preparing for the first customers. And though I am alone in this small apartment, the scent of bread rises through the floorboards as if I am being reminded each day that life can still offer sweetness after bitterness, that air can be warmed by something other than obligation. I keep the windows open even when the weather turns sharp, because I will never again trade sky for walls, never again accept the excuse that comfort is found in darkness, or that invisibility is a kindness. The apartment is modest. One room, a kitchen just large enough for a table, a window that looks onto the street where school children pass with their bright satchels. But to me, it is a palace, because every object in it is mine to arrange. Every decision is mine to make. And when I reach for a cup, no one returns it to me on a tray, with instructions to keep things downstairs. At night, when the city quiets and only the hum of traffic lingers, I sit by the window and write small notes to myself on slips of paper, not diaries filled with grief, but fragments of reminder. The date of the hearing, the look on the judge's face when she said my name, the smell of lemons on Carla's hands as she tried to fold my life into her order, the sound of the social worker's voice when she asked if I felt free to come and go. I write these things because memory is not only what others grant you, it is what you decide to keep alive, and I will not allow my story to be rewritten into something polite and false. Some nights I read the notes aloud and my voice startles me, low but certain, a voice I thought had been buried beneath concrete, but which still knows how to travel through air and claim space. Daniel has not called, and perhaps he never will. Or perhaps he will appear one day with apologies carefully composed. But I have stopped waiting for his voice to absolve mine. A mother's greatest mistake is to believe that love obliges her to endure any treatment so long as it comes from her child. And I see now that endurance without recognition is not love, but self-erasure. I still love him, But it is no longer the kind of love that begs for a seat at his table. It is the kind that allows me to live at mine, even if my table is smaller and my chair stands by itself. Carla passes me sometimes on the street, her chin tilted high as if the air belongs only to her, and I nod but do not stop, because acknowledgement is not the same as return. The photographs I took, the receipts, the evidence, they rest now in a drawer beside my bed, not because I need them daily, but because I want to remember that truth is not a feeling, but a record, and that even when others call you confused, your handwriting, your dates, your images are a map back to yourself. I sometimes imagine another woman, somewhere in another house, being told she is safer in the dark, and I want her to know what I know, that the stairs are yours to climb, that the world outside is not always kind, but it is wide, that silence is never protection, but only the absence of witnesses. So I live simply, but I live in my own light. I water the small plant that sits on the sill. I buy a fresh loaf from the baker once a week, even though the smell alone would sustain me. I greet the children as they pass. And in these gestures, I practice visibility because after years of being hidden, I understand that to be seen is not vanity, but survival. Some afternoons, I walk slowly to the park, sit on a bench, and let the sunlight touch my hands. And I whisper to the younger women hurrying past with their burdens heavy on their backs. Remember yourselves. Do not wait for others to carry your name into the air. And when night comes, and the city's lamps glow like small promises, I lie down with the window still open, the scent of bread drifting in, and I feel the simple truth that once seemed impossible. I am no longer beneath anyone's feet. I am no longer a secret kept in a cellar. I am not invisible. I am here, in my own room, in my own life, and my voice, however soft, has entered the record of the world.